Don't you hate murder?
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
Hi, my name is Phil, and you can consider me to be a video game newbie.
I'm Andy Hunter, a longtime fan of all things Nintendo.
I'm Kate, and I've never been more grateful for the plastic bag ban in the state of New Jersey.
All right, so why don't we pick up our conversation that we started from last episode. So last time, I introduced you all to Manhunt, a 2003 survival horror game developed by Rockstar North and published by Rockstar and Take-Two. Manhunt was the 2003 follow-up to Grand Theft Auto Vice City, in which the guys at Rockstar North tried to push into the edgy survival horror genre with a game that involved stealth with a heavy reliance on brutal executions with a snuff film aesthetic. And the game's heavy focus on violent takedowns and its snuff film inspirations caused some anxieties among not just members of the gaming press, but even some people who worked within Rockstar. And so what we're going to do is we're going to continue that conversation today and talk about some of the other people who saw some issues with Rockstar's latest title. Manhunt also created a predictable backlash among the people you'd most expect to take issue with it, our old friends moral conservatives. Manhunt was in development during what was for some a really exciting period in video game history. On the one hand, technical developments going back a decade allowed developers to create more visually impressive and realistic presentations, allowing for games that were more like film in their ability to convey a wider spectrum of storytelling, including better motion capture, FMV cutscenes, and higher quality voice acting. And a bunch of you pointed out that the amount of visual fidelity that these executions have shows that it's more sort of on the realistic side rather than sort of an over-the-top cartoonish NES quality or over-the-top mid-1990s Mortal Kombat fatality kind of thing. So it's kind of been playing into this higher production value. And of course, Rockstar North at the times were one of the gold standards in terms of pushing the technical limits of gaming. So this is part of the high end of this kind of thing. On the other hand, video games in the United States benefited from greater protection to explore more adult subjects, or, just put out more violence and sex, thanks to the development of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board in 1994. The board, which assigned games an age-based letter rating based on its content, allowed developers to cater to specific audiences, from young children to adults, allowing video games to grow from something perceived as a children's toy into a creative medium all its own. And if you want more on that, check out our 3-part series on the creation of VSRB. And all of this creative expression scared the hell out of some people who worried over the ramifications of more permissive content in games and what it would mean for poor little Timmy and Tammy and their impressionable young minds. As video game makers expanded the technical and narrative boundaries of games, as well as in some cases the boundaries of taste, some concerned individuals and groups pushed back, declaring to the industry and basically anyone who would listen, "Won't someone please think of the children?" And during Manhunt's development, violent video games came into its own as a full-blown political and public health issue, and a variety of politicians, pundits, and self-proclaimed experts warned of the potential corrupting influences of video games on young people. In addition to the episodes I've already referenced, check out our episode on violent video game research for more on that. And Manhunt was a kind of perfect storm for these people, a threat to the moral order of society for what it was as a game, who created it, and what it represented. On the one hand, it was a game whose core mechanics revolved around performing the most violent possible stealth kills developed by the makers of some of the most controversial games on the market. On the other hand, Manhunt represented the epitome of this permissive gaming landscape that had been developing for at least the past decade. I mean, how did we get from safe, family-friendly entertainment of the likes of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap to the brutality of Manhunt? How did we become so callous? And more importantly, what do we do about it? Yeah, Phil.
So usually when we have these conversations about video games and somebody makes that claim about one of these games, like that this is just, it's gratuitous, it's violence for violence sake, we could usually sit here and say, yeah, but that's not actually true to the experience of playing the game. If you were to actually sit down and play the game, you would find the gameplay experience a little more fun, or maybe you would just find it weird, and you're taking this one scene out of context. I think they kind of have a point with this game, right? That is the point.
Yeah, I mean, without having discussed, if at the end of the game there is any sort of, recontextualization of all the violence that you've committed over the course of the game, Yeah, it does kind of seem like you could certainly have done this game and have it just be you walk up to people and just like hit them over the head and they drop down unconscious. And like gameplay wise, things would be the same. But yeah, but instead they went the extra mile to do excessive and, realistic violence. Like we said, not over the top like a Mortal Kombat or something, but the type of violence one human could theoretically do to another human if they were sufficiently set in their goals.
And it's sort of, I guess there's a meanness to it, for lack of a better term. There's a mean streak to the gameplay, both in terms of, yeah, you're doing this up close and personal. But for instance, Kev, one of the more brutal kills I think you showed us was with the garrote wire, where it's not enough to strangle the person. He like turns them around and makes a point to look into his eyes while he's doing it, and you get extra points for that. It sounds like, or at least there's an incentive to do that sort of thing. That's not something that I enjoy. And I watch, for instance, a lot of horror, and there are certain types of horror movies where it's like, this isn't entertaining to watch, this isn't engaging, there's a writer for McSweeney's who talked about this, and she coined the term goredom. Like, I'm just sitting here watching this movie of people brutally murdering each other, and I'm bored, not in the way that like you're bored while you're, I don't know, waiting for the bus or something. It's just like, it's unpleasant and it's boring and it's vaguely nauseating, and why are we doing this? What is the point of this? And I guess, Andy, also to your point, unless there is some sort of recontextualization at the end of this game, it will be sort of like, what's the point? Like, well, Kevin and I just finished House of the Dead a few months ago. You remember how that video game ends?
It just stops. It just goes past the credits.
The two characters are like, well, we're done. Lunch? I think I saw Burger King up the street. Let's go.
It's like the end of Burn After Reading. What do we learn? But yeah, I think all these are good observations. I think, as I played a bunch of Manhunt, I haven't finished it, but I played about halfway through the game so far. And it does, in the moment to moment, it doesn't feel as gratuitous as sometimes pulling cutscenes can make it out to be. There is a certain challenge, and there is a certain element of a game talking about basically a whole bunch of bad people doing bad things. Like, at no point does it really make, that's not entirely true, but like for the most part, Cash he's an empty vessel. And so you don't really get any insights into him. We have a sense that he may have done something to get onto death row, that he's so eager and willing, or at least willing, not necessarily eager, to just go and kill people, but also that everyone he encounters is also terrible. And so it's kind of this sort of nihilistic world where everyone is bad, and like violence kind of is the only interaction that people have with each other. Like, the stalkers are there just to kill Cash. Cash is just there to kill the stalkers, and meanwhile, the director is just there to film all of this carnage. So I'm not saying it's a reason to go to the game and check out the game for it, but it is saying something. And again, that kind of goes into Rockstar, again, thought they were, at this time, they were making the Godfather of video games. They were making the Scarface of video games. We were saying the real important things in games. And like, there is a certain sense where they're trying to make this a kind of artistic, for lack of a better term, experience. But we could talk about a lot about how that plays out in a game like this. And it's definitely one of the biggest pieces of conversation that I think a lot of people took away from Manhunt was, is this too much? Is this gratuitous? Is it serving any kind of ends? Was a big topic of conversation about Manhunt. And I think it makes it, in some respects, one of the more complicated controversies we've covered on the show, because kind of everybody was having this conversation, both moral crusaders like your Leolinis, like your Hillary Clintons, but also like game developers and game critics. And as we're going to see when we go to reviews later on, even the players themselves are it sparks really complicated conversations regarding the use of violence in games. And so going back to this whole idea about moral conservatives being really concerned with this kind of content and people warning about what Manhunt may do. Case in point, on September the 29th, 2003, 2 months before Manhunt's release, the British tabloid The Express put out an article warning of the impending danger the public face from the makers of Grand Theft Auto, declaring, quote, a Scots computer company, which has been blamed for copycat killings in America based on their best-selling video game, have produced an even more violent follow-up. In Manhunt, players will be encouraged to kill victims by suffocating them with plastic bags, attacking them with knives, meat cleavers, and sledgehammers, and shooting them in the face with sawn-off shotguns, end quote. There's an awful lot of passive voice going on over here, so I thought I'd try to parse it out a little bit. If you're curious, they're saying that Rockstar Games have been linked to violence. Let's go into who's blaming them for copycat killings, because the person blaming Rockstar for copycat killings that the article implies will certainly escalate after Manhunt hit shelves was none other than lawyer, moral crusader, and self-proclaimed only sane lawyer in the state of Florida, Mr. Jack Thompson.
Woo!
We haven't heard from Jack in a while. It's good to have him back.
Look who's back. Back again.
I don't know. This feels like going from the frying pan into the fire with like Dave Grossman and then pivoting right into Jack Thompson.
Don't call it a comeback. I've been here for years suing you. All right. So at the time, they talked to Jack in this Express article. And at the time, Jack just happened to be preparing a wrongful death lawsuit against Rockstar and Take-Two, accusing the makers of Grand Theft Auto 3 of inspiring two Tennessee boys to open fire alongside Interstate 40 on June the 25th, 2003, resulting in the death of one person and the wounding of another. And if talking about Manhunt, a game that he had certainly never seen, let alone played, kept Thompson in the public spotlight as he prepared for that first of several lawsuits against Rockstar and Take-Two. Well, that's just a nice bonus for old Jack. You know, some people seek the spotlight and sometimes the spotlight seeks you. Regarding his persistent legal fights against the games industry, Thompson told the Express reporter, quote, "There's a culpability here that should be shared by those who are training kids to kill," end quote. And here I'll remind listeners that Jack's wrongful death lawsuits were frequently paired with incessant harassment campaigns against his legal foes and wild, baseless accusations that game manufacturers, especially Rockstar and Take-Two, were guilty of a litany of heinous crimes, from racketeering to bribery to personally trying to ruin Jack's life. And all of this and more eventually set the stage for Jack Thompson to be permanently banned from practicing law in 2008. And for more on that, check out our entertaining two-part series on Mr. Jack Thompson. Thompson's objections aside, Manhunt made its North American debut on November the 18th, 2003, followed by a European release 3 days later. And it didn't take long for Manhunt to quickly become public enemy number one for pretty much every major anti-video game activist out there. For example, not long after the game's release, U.S. Representative Joe Baca warned a reporter for the Chicago Tribune that Manhunt was a straight-up murder simulator, quote, telling kids how to kill someone, and it uses vicious, sadistic, and cruel methods to kill, end quote. As it turns out, at the time of Manhunt's release, the Democratic representative from California had a bill working its way through Congress that would impose a fine on anyone caught selling or renting a video game to anyone under the age of 18, quote, that depicts nudity, sexual conduct, or other content harmful to minors, end quote. Now, for Baca, Manhunt must have felt like an early Christmas present, a perfect example of why America needed this bill to protect its precious children from moral corruption. And assuming that's what he felt, too bad for him it didn't work, and his bill ended up dying in committee.
Presumably, though, he had a nice backup gig ready as the co-pilot for the Millennium Falcon.
Joe Buck, his cousin Chew.
Yeah.
In December 2003, Manhunt topped the National Institute of Media and the Family's annual top 10 list of the worst games of the year. We may cover Nymph in more detail in a later episode, but they're kind of a persistent lobbying and research group that's at this point advocating that, video games violence are harmful. We need better protections against them and all that stuff. So they're pretty active at this time.
It's not like the Razzies for movies. Like, I've never heard of this group. Like, this isn't like judging by the quality of gameplay, etc. This is bad because violence, or this is bad because sex. It's something like that when you say worst game of the year sort of thing.
Yeah, so they would do a publicity stunt every year. When near the end of the year, they would put out a report card, and every year they would do this thing with video games where they basically assess, how well is the industry doing at informing parents about it? How well are the games reflecting their ratings based on their content? And also, how well is it being enforced? So, like, if you are a kid going into your Toys R Us or whatever, and you go to buy an M-rated game and you're 16, will they let you do it? And they put out a report card every year for this. And as part of that, they would do this big reveal, what they thought were the top 10 worst games of either violent or sexually explicit games. They always hosted it in DC, and they invited any lawmakers who were around to be part of this. And for example, Joe Lieberman was a frequent attendee. He came basically every year. And so every year they would show off and they would have a video that went with them. Fun fact about them, the year that Hot Coffee was revealed in 2005, I'll never forget this. They showed the video because you can watch these on C-SPAN because C-SPAN recorded these. And they show the footage from a bunch of the other games, but they never accessed Hot Coffee. So they literally just have a blank screen with white text that says Grand Theft Auto Hot Coffee, and then they moved on. No one could be bothered to get the footage for them, and I just find that so funny. But anyway, going back to 2003, in December 2003, they have Manhunt on their list of the worst games of that year. In fact, Nymph head Dr. David Walsh was so outraged by Manhunt that he invented a new word to describe its depravity, calling Rockstar North's latest title a killographic as opposed to a pornographic game, putting Dr. Walsh in the running with killologist Dave Grossman over the dumbest use of the word kill. If you're curious, other games that joined Manhunt on NIMP's 2003 list included Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball, True Crime Streets of LA, and previous episode topic Postal 2. Incidentally, Def Jam Vendetta was a T-rated game that made the list that year, although to be fair, the rapper-themed wrestling game just may have had too many black people and ethnic music for David Walsh's taste. I hear they're fun games. Speaking of media watchdog groups, another called the Lion and Lamb Project included Manhunt in the 2003 edition of their Dirty Dozen list of media brands to avoid, placing Manhunt along the likes of Enter the Matrix, X2, Wolverine's Revenge, and WWE SmackDown, Here Comes the Pain, as games organization founder Daphne White felt were just too much for little Sarah and Jordan and their supple minds. Common Sense Media, meanwhile, awarded Rockstar Games a Golden Garbage Can Award during a January 22nd, 2004 presentation, handing it to the company thanks to Grand Theft Auto Vice City and Manhunt. I hope that they framed it somewhere.
You actually get a garbage can? Like, that'd be kind of cool.
I hope so. I wonder if they went that extra mile to get a trophy of a garbage can.
It sounds like, sort of like no, there's no such thing as negative attention, right? For this, I suppose. So I'm wondering, like, if anything, it seems like it would be more incentive for people to want to play it.
It's not an unfair observation. And as we go in more detail of some of these specific moral panics to Manhunt, I think we're going to see a bunch of that. Although I really don't think, skipping ahead, I haven't seen much evidence of Rockstar playing up the backlashes. They aren't really going into like, this is the game that, the man doesn't want you to play. They're not doing like running with scissors with Postal. Right. Anytime anybody gave them any attention, they're putting out a press release. Oh, the U.S. Postmaster General thinks this is a too extreme game. Joe Lieberman thinks this game is too extreme. I personally think that Rockstar was kind of too big for that. They didn't need to resort to that because people were already coming to them anyway, I think
that's what it said. Like, it's better that they don't respond, frankly, because then you're just going to get into a back and forth that probably wouldn't be productive. But it sounds like they don't have to do anything. They're not necessarily going, ooh, we love this press, but it's sort of like, I have to believe that it would perhaps still be like just the general buzz around this game. I remember when I read about it a few years ago that there was just this thought like, yeah, the GTA games are violent and this or that, but that Manhunt game is sort of like in a class of its own of being really sick and depraved. And to your point, whether you've actually played it or not.
And again, what's really interesting is that as far as I can tell, Rockstar's not really egging these people on. They're not going, it's like, oh yeah, everyone thinks we're the most extreme company, and they never do that, as far as I can tell.
So to carry that forward a little bit, you can do that in a situation where people are being absurd. They're not being absurd here. And Jack has a whole bunch of rehearsed talking points about the depravity of certain games. And, in this situation, all of those talking points, however sensational they are going to land.
Yeah. And this is also a time when people still took him seriously. A couple of years after this, so particularly in 2005, when he puts out his modest video game proposal, which we keep going back to on the show, which was his proposal that someone develop a game where all of his own personal enemies were brutally killed. That was kind of, for a lot of people, and even people who agreed with him, that was kind of the point where people realized, you know what? Jack is a bit much and we shouldn't be paying attention to him. And like we may cover this in a future episode, the National Institute on Meeting the Family is a good example of that because David Walsh and Jack Thompson were tight for a long time. And after the modest game proposal, David Walsh made a very public statement that says Jack does not represent us and told Jack to no longer associate with them. And it became one of the nastiest breakups you've ever seen. It is amazing how acrimonious it got. And I mean, this is Jack Thompson we're talking about, but that's going to be for a future episode because he did not take that well. But this is still a time in 2003 when Jack Thompson could say these outlandish things and they were still fairly mainstream. The same thing that Dave Grossman was saying this, Hillary Clinton was saying this, Leland Yee was saying this, and he's part of this. And this is still at the point where people thought he was someone to listen to. And it wasn't until later when the games industry and gamers in particular had been playing up the fact that like, this guy's a maniac. You shouldn't listen to him. But yeah, and it is very easy for Jack to do this because, one, he hated Rockstar at this point. He specifically targeted a lot of his lawsuits against them, and it does fit a lot of his existing talking points. Video games are harmful, video games are murder simulators, video games are too easy to get a hold of, and we need to do all these things like sue the games industry into oblivion. So it ticks off a lot of easy boxes. He doesn't have to do any new work for this. And a lot of his lawsuits, when you read them, are pretty much the same ones, cookie cuttered or slightly altered a bit. So he had at this point built a lot of his talking points. I think you make a good observation there, Phil. Going back to Common Sense Media Group, like I said, they give this golden garbage can to Rockstar. On top of that, they also put a review of Manhunt on their website where they warned the M-rated game that I'm pretty sure literally everyone was in agreement for moral crusaders to gamers to Rockstar themselves was not appropriate for children, was in fact not appropriate for children, writing, quote, "Parents need to know that this is one of the most violent games ever produced. The premise is that you advance by stalking and murdering victims. The murder scenes are depicted with very realistic graphics. Since the game rewards and glamorizes brutal murder, it is definitely inappropriate for children and teenagers," end quote. Gee, you think? And we're going to see this. A lot of the conversation revolves around everyone making the exact same point, which is that nobody thought this is for kids. This was a game not specifically made for kids, but everybody's making that same argument where it's like there are some people who are saying that like the moral crusaders are like, it's not made for kids and therefore it shouldn't be made at all. Whereas people like Rockstar are saying, games can be for mature audiences. And this is a game specifically designed for a mature audience. Kids should not be playing this game. So it's kind of one of those issues of a debate where everyone's making the exact same point. In fact, the prospect of digitally suffocating someone with a plastic bag while you pounded their face in also scared at least 2 sovereign nations in 1 Canadian province. On December the 12th, 2003, Bill Hastings, head of New Zealand's Office of Film and Literature Classification, announced Manhunt was banned from the same country that gifted the world with bad taste and Dead Alive for being, quote, injurious to the public good, end quote. Reportedly, this gave Manhunt the dubious distinction of being the very first game to be banned in New Zealand. Under the law, any New Zealander caught in possession of the game was subject to a $2,000 fine, and anyone who attempted to market, display, or sell the game could be fined between $20,000 and $50,000 and face up to a year of imprisonment. This prompted some intrepid Kiwis to buy the game in Australia and smuggle it into the country, viewing the risk of a fine of up to $10,000 or up to 6 months in jail as a small price to pay to kill some dumb fuck. Meanwhile, on March the 3rd, 2004, Ontario's Film Review Board issued Manhunt an R for restricted rating, with Film Review Board Minister Jim Watson observing, quote, "If you've seen this video, you realize, quite frankly, it's really disturbing," end quote. Why the province waited a full 3 months after the game's release to reclassify the M-rated game is a mystery to me. Whatever the impetus, the new rating effectively banned Manhunt for sale or rental to anyone under the age of 18, with minors who attempted to procure it, subject to a fine of up to $25,000 or up to 1 year in prison, and people who sold game to said minors subject to a fine of up to $100,000. Meanwhile, a Halifax politician named Joan Massey also announced they plan to introduce a bill in the Nova Scotia legislature to require ID to buy or rent violent video games, citing Manhunt as a reason for such a restriction. Speaking of late responses, 8 days after New Zealand banned it, on March 11th, 2004, Germany's Federal Review Board for Media Harmful to Minors added Manhunt to their list of media harmful to young people, and as a result, Take-Two opted to not sell the game in Germany, although people could still buy it online. The country escalated its war against Manhunt on July the 19th, 2004, when the District Court of Munich ordered all copies of the game seized from retailers. Meanwhile, in less civilized countries such as the US and UK, the local rating systems made the bold decision that they would not bar Manhunt from sale, although they made clear something I don't think was in much dispute from anyone, that Manhunt wasn't appropriate for children. The British Board of Film Classification gave Manhunt an 18 rating. Meanwhile, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board issued Manhunt an M for mature rating, indicating it was appropriate for people aged 17 and older, given descriptors of blood and gore, intense violence, and strong language. Skipping ahead, the ESRB's decision would leave some to question why it didn't receive the more severe AO or adults-only rating, which indicated a level of violence or sexual content too extreme to be sold in American stores.
Can I jump in? I'm not really sure how to tie this in, but I've heard this argument a lot about this particular piece of media, whether it's a movie or a video game or a book, whatever. This is not for children. Children, this is harmful because kids could read it and it would be harmful for them. And then the argument, as you said, Kevin, is like, well, this isn't intended for children. Like, children shouldn't be playing this game or watching this movie or what have you. And often it feels to me like when kids get exposed to something that does them harm for a reason like this, this isn't what happens all the time. Sometimes, a kid really wants to do this and they're going to find a way to do it. But sometimes it's also just like whoever is in charge of what they get to watch or play or what have you isn't paying attention. For instance, I'm reminded of several years ago, the Alan Moore graphic novel, I think it was Neonomicon, was actually pulled from Greenville Public Library, I believe. It was in Greenville, South Carolina. Pulled from the shelf because a child checked it out of the library and their grandmother, I think, or their mother saw it, and it's not for kids and there's some tough stuff in there. And the idea was like, well, why would you let a kid check this out? And it was like, this book did not come from the children's section at the library. The kid found it somewhere, wherever it was shelved in the library. And in fact, this kid couldn't check out the book himself. He didn't just go up and say, I want this book, and then they just gave it to him. His grandmother, in fact, had to check it out, and she did. Or again, mom, whoever his guardian was, who then objected to it after looking at it later, said, why would you let him borrow this book? And it's like, you let him borrow this book. When he brought it over to you to check out, you could have thumbed through it a little bit and been like, this is not for a little kid. We're not getting this. Or you could say, you know what, I think he can handle it. I decided I'm going to do that. But then acting like it's someone else's fault when there's been a lapse of judgment on your part.
Hey there, fellow netizens. This is Kevin in the editor's chair with a brief addendum for this section here. Kate asked me to chime in here with some clarifications about their talking points about the challenge against Neonomicon. And they recommended an article to me from the December 6, 2012 edition of the Los Angeles Times to help set the record straight. So here's what happened in this situation. So in 2012, Carrie Gaskey, a parent in South Carolina, took her daughter into the Greenville County, South Carolina library, whereupon her 14-year-old daughter asked to check out Neonomicon, at which point Gaskey briefly perused through the book, thinking initially that it was a children's mystery comic book, and checked it out for her daughter. However, once she got the book home, her daughter asked for clarification on a word that she didn't understand, whereupon Gaskey gave it a more careful look and found herself disturbed by the content, comparing Alan Moore's content to Hustler or Playboy, and then filed a challenge with the Greenville County Library. The Greenville County Library set up an internal committee to review the book. They temporarily pulled the book from circulation and ultimately advised that the book should be returned to circulation. However, the library system head Beverly James effectively overrided their ruling and unilaterally decided to remove the book from circulation, an action that prompted denunciations from several First Amendment groups such as the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and the National Coalition Against Censorship. So that's a little bit more clarification on that. I will also include a link in the description to the Los Angeles Times article for more information on that. Anyway, back to the show.
I'm also reminded that there's an anecdote that I saw on, I think it was on TikTok, somebody who used to work at a movie theater who said their least favorite movie of all time is the movie Sausage Party. Not for any reason related to the movie itself, but he was like, I cannot tell you how many times a parent brought a small child to that movie because it's animated, I guess, and they just, even though it is clearly rated R, they actually put a sign up at the box office, something like, note, the movie Sausage Party is rated R and it contains sex and violence and all. It is not for children. And to the point where even when they saw an adult coming up with an obvious child and said 2 for Sausage Party, they would say, just so you know, this movie is rated R, it's not for children. Like, yeah, just give me the tickets. And even those same people who were told explicitly right before they bought the tickets, this is not a movie for kids, take the kid to the movie anyway, and then come back out and get mad at the people who sold them the tickets.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I noticed this, and you see this in kind of other moral backlashes. Comics, good example, mentioning Neonomicon. Video games is too. We can say, particularly with the movie like Sausage Party, which is an animated film, is that I think there's a perception among some people that those things are associated with children. That for a long time, video games are considered toys, and comic books are for kids, and animation is for kids. And therefore, it kind of pushes out of their worldview that there are these things that are being developed for people who are not children. And for some people, that's an argument of you need to be more discerning about media because these forms of media are not just for children. And then you have, on the other hand, you have guys like Jack Thompson definitely advocates for this thing as basically that because these things are for children, that video games are for children, therefore you should not have any content that isn't for children. They're basically assuming that the media is just for kids and only kids are playing this. And therefore, any content that's in there, even if it's rated above them, and even if it's explicitly said for adults, is somehow still for kids. And you also see this in other conservative arguments. You think about the greater push for book bans in the United States are often about reading lists and school libraries, where it's like a kid could get access to this book that, tells them that gay people exist, kind of thing. And we need them to not get that. And like Jack, for example, and we'll see this in later fights he has, particularly with Manhunt 2, is that he basically saw the M rating as an admission of guilt from the games industry that this piece of media is explicitly harmful to children. Not just that it's not appropriate, but that this is a mind-warping, hazardous substance. And therefore, we need to ban it from access to children. And what's also funny, though, about Jack Thompson is he says this and basically says that the ESRB says that the game is harmful and mind-warping, but will then in the same breath say that the ESRB is bullshit and it's just put together by the industry to cover their ass and we shouldn't listen to it anyway because Jack is not what you call ideologically consistent. But this comes up over and over again as this perception of the medium in which is producing it. And therefore, like, we shouldn't have anything for kids. And I think that's the constant conversation you see, like, you know, more adult-oriented comic books and more adult-oriented animation and more adult-oriented video games that, like, we need to understand that this is a medium that not just children enjoy, even if you think of them as just for kids. And this is one of the things that makes covering the backlash to Manhunt so frustrating because, again, as I said before, it reveals a debate in which both the game supporters and critics are effectively making the same argument, that Manhunt is not appropriate for kids. And it's safe to say that pretty much everyone who came across Manhunt, from game journalists covering it, to ratings and classification boards like the ESRB, to politicians, to media critics, to moral crusaders, to gamers, to the makers of everyone is in agreement that Manhunt's not for kids. And it seems like it's just a question about, like, how do we approach that? So, for example, someone in the game journalism scene, this isn't for kids. Use caution with who you're going to expose this to. And Rockstar would say this game is specifically made for adults. We're trying to push some adult themes. Whereas a guy like, you know, Leland Yee or Jack Thompson or a person like Hillary Clinton is going to say, this is not for children, and therefore we need to make sure that by legislation, if necessary, that this won't be in access of children. Because, again, we're associating video games with, like, cigarettes, you know? And it's also just important to understand that this is during that formative time when game companies like Rockstar were pushing video games as a medium and exploring the narrative and artistic boundaries of video games. I mean, the late 1990s into the 2000s saw huge leaps in both graphical and narrative innovations. I mean, this is when we get sort of the birth of the modern video game horror genre, like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem are all coming out, and they are pushing the boundaries of fear, empowerment, and exploring complex themes like trauma, power or lack thereof, and existential dread. Other games are bridging the gap between games and films. Like, you're seeing a lot more games that are bringing in, for example, you know, FMV scenes from actual films. We're bringing in named voice actors. A great example of that is Enter the Matrix. Enter the Matrix comes out the same year as Manhunt. And that game was basically designed as a tie-in to The Matrix Reloaded and Matrix Revolutions. It has scenes that are supposed to complement those movies. There are even filmed scenes that explain things in the movie. So, like, for example, they have the whole thing when the actress who played the Oracle in The Matrix and Matrix Reloaded passed away, and they recast her. In Enter the Matrix, they explain canonically why they do that. So you get more of the picture of that. So we're having this sort of blending, the synergy between games and film at this time, in addition to pushing all these other themes. And, like, on top of it, we see more games that are pushing more deep, mature themes. Like Max Payne comes around this time. The original Max Payne comes out in 2001 by Remedy Software. And in 2003, Max Payne 2, The Fall of Max Payne was coming out. So we have this sort of gritty noir, which was something that hadn't really been seen in games before. So this is kind of a really important period with video games as a creative medium. And on the other hand, there were certainly more than a few people who clung to the idea that video games were first and foremost children's toys, and therefore all of them must be made safe for kids, rather than a communications medium that could cater to a broad spectrum of audiences. And those critics fought tooth and nail to maintain video games perception as nothing more than childhood playthings. So, like, for example, when Hillary Clinton reacted to Hot Coffee, she held a press conference on July the 14th, 2000.
Now, was she able to unlock that footage?
I would love to see
many playthroughs of GTA. Sorry,
I would pay to see Hillary Clinton bringing up an action replay and booting up a copy of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas for the PS2 and entering in the laborious codes to get to Hot Coffee and doing that. That would be something. Maybe that would have helped her beat Trump. I don't know. But I would have loved to see that. As far as I know, she didn't show any footage because that was also a situation where, like, everyone who was a moral crusader was just saying this exists and letting people fill in the gaps. Like I said, I love that whole thing with Nymph where they just showed a blank screen. Imagine how terrible this might have been. But in that press conference warning about Hot Coffee, she denounced the mod and demanded that violent and sexually explicit games be treated like a harmful substance like tobacco and alcohol, and later compared their effects on young minds to the effects of lead poisoning. So it's not that just as a creative medium for different audiences. This is a toxic substance, basically. And Manhunt's content fit easily into this narrative of video games as a harmful substance, and the potential that children could access it was enough of a justification for moral critics to call for limitations, if not outright bans, on video game content they found objectionable. And it's not an argument they could have made against like printed word or film we expect to be taken seriously, but it still held sway over video games at that time, because again, this is part of that maturation of video games. In fact, I'm actually curious, and we were kind of starting to talk about this before, I'm really curious how much Rockstar North had been trying to deliberately provoke this kind of reaction from people like, Hillary Clinton and David Walsh and Joe Lieberman and all of them with Manhunt. And I feel there's a reasonable case to be made that they weren't just trying to be deliberately edgy, like a running with scissors, where they're trying to be both deliberately edgy and get people to pay attention to them so that then they can use that to promote their own brand. I don't think Rockstar is doing that. I'm going to offer some explanations about why. Because for one thing, everything I've read about Rockstar's management at this time points to a company that was looking to push boundaries and expand video games as an art form. And if you want a good example of that, check out David Kushner's book, Jacked, for a lot on the history of Grand Theft Auto during this particular time. Because the guys at the top making decisions over the GTA series, they thought they were making the Godfather or the Scarface of video games and pioneering what you could show and tell through the medium. And in fact, the way Rockstar promoted and talked about Manhunt leads me to believe that they saw this as, in some respects, a prestige picture, one that was about critical acclaim rather than, being super edgy. There was a lot of edgelord content when it comes to how they're promoting this. For example, their marketing is really surprisingly reserved for this game. And it's pretty surprising considering you can cut a dude's head off and throw it out to enemies to distract and terrify them. But as far as I can tell, they're not really playing up those parts in the marketing. So for example, there was a 2-page spread on Manhunt that ran in the December 2003 issue of PSM that appeared to lean more into the game's intense horror atmosphere rather than its violence. It basically repeated the back of the box description I read before. Do you want to add something, Phil?
Just wanted to ask a question. Did you already get into how this game sold?
I'm glad you asked that. We're not going to cover that today, but I can tell you, skipping ahead, it sold reasonably well. It seemed to have sold at least beyond what their initial expectations were of it, and it sold enough to warrant a sequel, which we'll cover in a future episode.
The sequel is the one that uses the motion controls.
The Wii version, yes.
Yeah.
Someone decided to make a Wii version of Manhunt too. And so this ad, it seems to really play up more this sort of, gritty world where it's kill or be killed, but they're not doing like a lot of, blood and boobs that you expected from a lot of advertising from video games at this time. And meanwhile, a single page ad that ran several months later in the February 2004 issue of PSM replaced the copy with an excerpt from a review from the Chicago Tribune describing Manhunt as, quote, the most important game of the last 5 years, end quote. And so they're focusing more on Manhunt's critical acclaim rather than its content, which leads me to believe that Rockstar was aiming for a critically acclaimed art rather than for grindhouse trash. So they're going more for the high art in a certain respect. And meanwhile, I've seen TV ads from around this time that also emphasize more of the cat and mouse survival elements rather than the gore. And I have a contrast to this, a game that came around the same time. Has anyone heard of The Suffering?
Yes.
What do you know about The Suffering?
I remember my first exposure to it was a full-page ad in, I think, the Xbox magazine of a severed human head sitting in a filthy toilet bowl with the caption, "Prison is hell." So I took that to mean you were an incarcerated person in a really tough maximum security-esque prison and violence ensues. Sounds like maybe like Manhunt, but in a prison.
Yeah, so Suffering was a contemporary of Manhunt. It was developed around the same time. So Suffering was developed by Surreal Software and was published by Midway. And it was a part survival horror, part action horror game where players assume the role of Torque, an escaped death row inmate trapped in a prison beset by supernatural forces. So there are kind of some superficial similarities between The Suffering and Manhunt. They're both in development around the same time. They're both gritty games that rely a certain element on stealth. Although my understanding is The Suffering is a little more action-oriented than Manhunt is. And it was supposed to come out around the same time. So Manhunt comes out in November 2003. Originally, The Suffering was supposed to come out on Halloween 2003. And it eventually got its release date pushed back to March of 2004 when it came out for the PS2 and Xbox. And like you said, Kate, I was actually going to bring that up too. It's a great observation, which is their ads really lean into the edgy stuff. Yeah, they have this ad of a severed head in a toilet saying prison is hell. So it's kind of, in terms of the way they're presenting this game, like, it's kind of surprising that The Suffering didn't get more of a moralist backlash. And what I suspect is part of that is because, if you're in the non-gaming crowd, Rockstar, Grand Theft Auto, but you don't necessarily know some of the other ones like Midway. Midway was an established company at that time, but we're not in terms of, the big players. Like Rockstar and Take-Two were kind of one of the big dogs in the industry. All this is to say, I don't think that Rockstar was deliberately trying to egg people on and try to trigger a moral controversy. I think it's more that, Rockstar was probably going to get a controversy because of who they are. But I don't think, again, they were like, going back to running with scissors, I don't think they were like running with scissors where it's like, don't you want to get mad at us?
Don't you hate murder?
Yeah.
Don't you hate plastic bags?
Oh, get angry about us. On top of that, I also don't think Rockstar deliberately marketed Manhunt based on controversy because controversy already had a way of finding them. For example, in late 2003, around the same time Manhunt released, the company got into trouble thanks to a mission in Grand Theft Auto Vice City called Naval Engagement. And during the mission, Tommy Vercetti has to disrupt members of a Haitian gang, wherein the in-game text instructs the player to, quote, kill all the Haitians on the boats, end quote. Following a segment on New York's local CBS News affiliate, where reporters accused Rockstar of, quote, cashing in on racism and violence, end quote, several Haitian American activist groups accused the company of encouraging genocide against Haitians. So that escalated quickly. On November the 25th, 2003, the New York-based, and so this is about 2 weeks after Manhunt comes out. On November 25th, 2003, the New York-based Haitian Centers Council and Haitian Americans for Human Rights put out a joint statement denouncing Grand Theft Auto Vice City as a, quote, cultural attack on the millions of Haitians living in the United States, end quote. The group appealed to New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg to take action against Rockstar, whose headquarters was in New York City. And in response, Take-Two published an apology and vowed to remove the mission in future versions of the game. Now, this didn't stop the Florida-based Haitian American Coalition of Palm Beach County, Florida, from taking legal action against the company. And in December the 23rd, 2003, they filed a lawsuit against Rockstar, Take-Two, Microsoft, Sony Computer Entertainment, Walmart, Target, and Best Buy, demanding $15,000 in damages and the game to be pulled from shelves. I don't know if anything came of this lawsuit. I haven't seen many news outside of when they file it. As far as I know, it didn't really go anywhere. But if people know, scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear some sources on that. And this is all happening at the same time that Jack Thompson filed this $246 million wrongful death lawsuit against Sony Computer Entertainment America, Take-Two Interactive, Rockstar Games, and Walmart on behalf of the families of Aaron Hamill, a 45-year-old registered nurse from Knoxville, Tennessee, who was shot and killed, and Kimberly Beatty of Moneta, Virginia, who was wounded by stray gunfire while driving on Interstate 40 through Newtown, Tennessee. The two shooters, 15-year-old William Buckner and his 14-year-old stepbrother Joshua, told police while in custody that they were recreating scenes in Grand Theft Auto 3 as they took potshots at pigeons and passing cars with a pair of .22s they stole from Will's dad. As Thompson told an ABC News reporter when he announced this lawsuit, quote, we want to send a message that a huge verdict to Sony and Take-Two Interactive and the entire video game industry that if they're going to continue to market adult-rated games to children with these horrific consequences, then we're going to take their blood money from them and send a message to their boards that they have to stop this practice or there will be other suits on behalf of other people killed by these games, end quote. Thank you very much, Mr. Jack Thompson. This case, did you want to jump in, Phil?
No, just way to nail that impression.
There are a few joys in this life that I enjoy more than the Jack Thompson was. The case was eventually dismissed, this Jack Thompson case. However, it would not be the last time Thompson directed his care and energy toward the makers of Grand Theft Auto, and the topic of his special rage on for Rockstar and Take-Two will be something we cover in a future episode, so stay tuned for that. All of this is to say that I don't think Rockstar was going out of its way to provoke controversy as a selling point for Manhunt, although that, of course, didn't stop observers from noting that the game's emphasis on grindhouse-style violence would likely attract a moralist backlash. However, based on what we covered, it would appear that by the standards of the show, Manhunt's a pretty mundane moral panic. I mean, game with provocative content, developed by a company with a history of putting out controversial games to attract controversy. It's all pretty humdrum for us. Except, there's another controversy connected with Manhunt. But we're going to cover that next time. So I hope you'll check back in next month as we explore whether this alleged murder simulator actually caused a real-life murder. And this is where things are going to get interesting. So how are we doing? Any thoughts on where we've gone so far?
Yeah, I don't know. I went from never having heard of this game to wondering why they put so much, like we said, it's not over the top, but right up to the top violence in a way that seemed unnecessary. But I don't know. So far, I haven't played the game. I've only seen some clips. So far, I don't feel inspired to murder, but we'll see if I'm convinced that it did inspire somebody wants to murder. And I guess, if I do want to get inspired to murder, I guess I'll have to play the game again.
So a theme with some of these episodes is, in liberal societies, you will always have trouble ensuring the bounds of freedom, where in conservative societies, you will always have trouble determining the bounds of authoritarianism. So in the society we live in, trying to determine the bounds of, freedom and our autonomy and what we can create, you're always going to get run as one of the moral panic people, because it will always be a constant debate where the line is. And even if it's established one year, the next year, things could change. So if you're going to make your bread and butter in this society being one of those watchdogs, games like this are a godsend, because this is something, this is the pitch to hit. There's nothing that this game can really do to combat whatever talking points you want to make about it. And this game will continue to give the Jack Thompsons of the world more ammunition for years to come. So it's kind of a savvy move. There's always going to be something you can talk about.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, that there's always going to be, like I said at the beginning of the episode, like, who are we offending today? It's like, okay, so we know someone's going to get offended by this. I think that cannot have been surprising and for the developers of the game. And to a certain extent, it sounds like it was intentional. And I'm not saying one way or the other how I feel about the intentionality of I'm going to make something that will be offensive for the sake of making something offensive. Because that's the other thing with this particular game I'm seeing so far is like, why did they make this apart from trying to drum up controversy? It's, it doesn't seem like a particularly fun game. I don't think that there's anyone to root for in the game. Andy, I think you were saying that earlier. It's like, who are we rooting for? Whose side are we supposed to be on? And Kevin, I think you said the main person's an empty vessel. It seems like, if anything, the gameplay gets pretty repetitive. And so it does seem like, what was the point of making this game? But at the same time, it's the quote, I disapprove of what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. It's like, I might not personally like this game. I may personally find it icky or downright offensive. Certainly if one of, a child I knew was playing it and got scared, I'd be upset on their behalf. But I'm not going to say that it simply shouldn't exist.
Yeah, I think these are all fantastic points. And I think that you made a great point there, Phil, where it's like, this is going to create a conversation for the moral panic crowd and sort of the media, freedom of expression crowd. There's something that people can pull from Manhunt that you could basically turn it into whatever argument you want it to be. If you want to talk about that, we need to have free expression. We need to be able to say things in a medium. This medium is not just for children. We need to be able to have content like this that we can talk about where we're not in a fear of it being suppressed in some way. And then you get people who are like, well, we need to make sure that children have either some sort of mediated access to these content, or maybe that we don't expose to them at all. But then that raises the question, was this for children at all? I would argue that it probably wasn't. In fact, I'd say pretty explicitly it wasn't. But it does come at that really complicated, Manhunt is kind of a complicated nexus point for video games, because we're only a couple of years removed from Columbine, and Columbine became sort of and we'll talk about this in a future episode, became kind of the lightning rod by which we talk about violent video games, which is kind of continued to this day. So always that question about are video games influencing violence in society? And then we get this game where specifically the goal of the game is to commit the most depraved acts of violence and then move on and do that more and more and more. That being said, there's also this is also a time of media where it's we had reality shows. We had the rise of the found footage horror genre, where there's a certain element of media has to be real and raw and edgy. And it's also not for nothing. This is also this is right at the start of the war in Iraq. And so this is also a time when people are complaining about a game like Manhunt. And at the same time, the nightly news is showing airstrikes in Kabul and in Baghdad. And so there's it comes at a really, really interesting, very complex point when it comes to the way we talk about media, when we talk about not just games, but how are we exposed to violence in general? What does things like Columbine mean? What does the things like the war on terror mean? It's just, it's such a meaty topic for Manhunt. There's a lot of angles you could approach on that. Phil, I saw you raise your hand on something.
Yeah, Kevin, you really alluded to one of the things I was going to speak to, which is the context of this being 2 years after 9/11 and what American policies were. So in many ways, everything that happens after 9/11 is some kind of commentary on 9/11. And especially here, you could view this game as a defense of killing with impunity because, the nation may feel like it needs to establish its right or the moral high ground in being able to go around and kill with impunity.
And jumping off of that, another way you could look at this, if we're looking at this as like a funhouse mirror, this is what things like 9/11, this is what this has turned us into. So I think there's an argument to be made there that we now have this game where, like, again, people were even making the arguments at the time about, like, things like Survivor, watching people eat bugs on TV because that's entertaining. And, like, again, watching things like the airstrikes during the start of the war on terror and watching 9/11 and seeing the towers come down, and like that we've now got an environment where, like, you can make the argument for Manhunt, like, this is a world where, like, this is taken to its furthest extreme. All there is violence. All there is are people who are willing to kill. And not only that, we have someone who is willing to basically commodify that violence, film it from every single angle for whatever needs they want. And, like, in some ways, it's like, okay, this is what those years have wrought. This is what in the post 9/11 years have happened. And so I think there's that angle with that too.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Like, just the notion of, everybody is out here to get you. Everyone you encounter is just a person who hasn't tried to kill you yet. So instead of waiting for them to kill you, you might as well take the battle to them and get them before they get you. Hence, nation building. It's like we just got to go into these crazy countries and rebuild them before they try to rebuild us.
And what was the overwhelming political force in the United States, especially in the early 2000s? Preemptive strike. So very much that, a violent enemies in all angles. You need to take them out before they get us. I think that's a really salient observation.
Yeah. So maybe this is just a game of its time, or at least there's that angle there. If it feels weird to us that there would be any kind of appetite for a game like this at all, maybe that angle explains it.
And skipping ahead, there have been some retrospectives from the last couple of years that suggest that Manhunt may be becoming more relevant today, in a world where, like, social media dominates and everyone is a content creator in some respect, where we're all putting out stuff out there. And on top of that, with the sort of surveillance state in places like the US and the UK that have wrought over the last 2 odd decades since 9/11. And, like, there's a lot to this. Some people are even arguing this game is more relevant now, but that is something we'll cover next time.
Sorry, real quick. Has anybody read anything about Superman versus Batman and how, like, at the start of the 20th century, Superman was the most popular superhero, and then suddenly it changed and Batman became the most popular superhero in America, and why that happened?
I have not seen that.
So one of my friends who wrote a thesis about this in college said that you could interpret it as a take on how America was changing its view of itself. Like, Superman was popular in the beginning of the 20th century because he's an immigrant with superpowers, and he has to learn how to harness all the powers that he didn't know he had to go out there and do the right thing. And that's sort of holding a mirror up to the nation, America embracing the power it has on the world stage, and then how to harness this to be the good guy, or to be the hero and go out and do good. And then as things go from the end of World War II to the Korean War to Vietnam, the Cold War, America's going from we're clearly out here to do good to, the right thing is whatever we say it is. I'm the anti-hero. The only reason all of you get to live in freedom is because there are terrible men out there prepared to do terrible things. And that's how America sees itself. And that's how we got Batman as the most popular superhero. And I see a lot of those parallels in what is popular, or at least what people think might become popular in society. So when we see a game like this get made, I think you have to take what the nation espouses about itself and what it has the right to do as, at that point, the lone superpower in the world, as some kind of angle as to why it might be popular.
Yeah, I think this is something really interesting. And I know that the guys who were in charge at Rockstar, like Sam and Dan Houser, the Houser brothers, were really interested in American culture. They were these two British guys, and they were really interested in this idea of American culture. And you see that radiating through the Grand Theft Auto games. And, like, we're talking about, like, New York in Grand Theft Auto 3, and the sort of 1980s excesses in Vice City, and the early 1990s Los Angeles in San Andreas. And so like seeing a window into US culture and seeing that and like, Thatcherite culture in the UK and things like that. I think there's a lot there. Again, I think what's really cool about Manhunt, there's a lot of ways you can talk about it and a lot of parallels you could make to contemporary issues going on for when it was made. Like I think it's a really good example of something like that. Any other final points we want to add before we wrap up?
Maybe just one quick one, with a lot of Japanese cultural like pieces of art or whatever, we see the lens of nuclear bombings as an inspiration for that, like, kaiju and Godzilla and everything that happens in a lot of anime, like, Neon Genesis Evangelion. And that may be easy for us to see because it seems so unusual to us from the outside looking in. But who's to say from the angle of Japanese people that that's easy to, like, maybe some folks might be like, oh yeah, I guess now that you mentioned it, that there could be an angle there where that's about, nuclear explosions. So if we were to take the same angle and look from the outside in at the creation of this game as a commentary on American society, it might be easy for other cultures to look at us and say, wow, your society is obsessed with justifying the need to kill with impunity. Like every fucking thing you produce is in some way about trying to justify your need to go out there and kill. And it's obvious to us, but it's scary to us that it's not obvious to you. That's another angle I see of this game.
That is something, and I think that there's definitely an argument to be made there. And I think that's a pretty good note on the next time. This is going to go an angle that you're not going to expect, which is going to, one, talk about these kinds of conversations and about the role of violence in the media and violence in society, and also just how we talk about video games during this time. As again, we raise that question about, can video games actually lead to violence? And was Manhunt an episode where that may have happened? And that's something we'll talk about next time. And so that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seek Me by Seek Knowledge. We have a free music archive used under a CC BY NC SA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
I'm Phil Thomas.
I'm Andy Hunter.
I'm Kate.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube.